Hello， 大家好，我是利恩。很多看我们节目的观众朋友呢，都会知道说我们很喜欢讨论很多关于欧美国家在左派跟右派的这些思想议题上面的辩论或者是一些不同主张的这个探讨。但是随着这次2024年美国总统大选呢，很多观众朋友就觉得说，奇怪了，怎么好像这个右派或者说偏保守主义这边呢，反而很多的论述都比左派要来的有条理，而且有逻辑。而怎么感觉呢？左派总是好像缺乏的一些比较专业的、比较好的论述能力的人呢，来与右派进行抗衡或进行辩论。没问题，我已经听到许多观众留言的这个心声了所以呢，我今天特别找一段呢，是在2016年11月19号的时候，加拿大的 CBC 电视台呢，他们邀请了右派最强的临床心理学教授 Jordan Peterson 呢，跟同隶属于多伦多大学的另外一个左派的教授，就是 AWP 的呢，针对加拿大那个时候即将要推出的 C16 法案进行辩论。那我先简单介绍一下这个 C16 法案就是加拿大政府其实他在2017年的时候他就通过了，主要就是把这个性别认同跟性别表达呢就纳入到了加拿大更早以前的人权法案里头当为一部分。可是它的目的是在保护跨性别者，避免接受这个所谓歧视跟仇恨的言论但是我也跟大家提到过，其实歧视性这样的东西是非常主观的如果一旦你把它设成立法的时候，事实上这个其实是更严格的，或者说更极端的一种言论审查。因为如此呢 Jordan Peterson 呢是非常反对 C16 这个法案，认为政府没有权利可以干涉个人想要说出来的话，或者说出来的主张那么这个时候多伦多大学有许多的教授就联合起来抨击Jordan Peterson 教授呢对于反对 C16 法案的通过是一个非常不重视跨性别者这样子的一个主张。而这个时候呢，多伦多大学的物理学教授，也就是我们刚讲到 AWP 教授呢，我们简称他叫做 Pete 教授。Pete 教授呢，最有趣的就是他自己本身是一个非二元性别且是跨性别的教授他对外的称呼是使用 they 跟 them 这是他的代称词。那我们之前也有一部影片已经详细的介绍过这个代称词呢，其实是霸凌全世界的一种模式。我们就来听听看，属于这么高知识分子又是跨性别者的教授呢，会怎么的来跟 Jordan Peterson 教授展开辩论。虽然一边是心理学家，一边是物理学家，看起来领域好像相差很大，但是到底针对所谓跨性别者的这个代称词的权利，到底是不是应该纳入到立法而成为一个强迫全国民众都必须要遵守的规范呢？我们来听听看两方激烈的主张跟看法是有如何的一个不同吧。 Let's go。
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Well, we have a graphic to show our audience at home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them you see here Z or Zim, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or A rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there.
在这边我先稍作暂停，给大家补充一下刚刚你看到主持人列出的那个表格，可能有的观众朋友是第一次见到。其实这个在 Lgbtq 团体这张表格已经非常久了，就是英文传统的所谓男性的 he、女性的 she， 还有所谓多数的 they 呢，其实这三个代称词已经不是现在 LGBTQ 团体主要的三个用法了，他们自创了很多新词，这个是在过去的英文里头所没有的，那目前也并没有被收录在字典当中，就是所谓刚主持人讲到什么日here日我只能说这种东西主持人自己恐怕都讲不清楚。好， 但是呢，先补充给观众朋友知道，确实他们现在有很多这种所谓新的代称词语言，因为那个照他们的说法，就是会很多是让他们自己听起来更符合它的属性。但是这个别人念不念得清楚就不好说了。还有一个点就是，目前在美国已经承认的97种的所谓的这种多元性别来讲的话，恐怕你这个代称词是远远还不够的，对吗？你没有办法完全的去涵盖到这97种。所以另外一个问题就是，人真的记得住吗？
Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. In New Zealand, where I grew up, academics have a statutory role enshrined in the Education Act to be a critic and conscience of society. So I think that's an idea worth exporting to Canada. So I'd like to give Peterson about a B+ for his critic role recently, and an F for the conscience part. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. Has a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So, for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. And it's also absurd. I mean, here's one thing that's happened that I don't believe the formulators of this legislation ever foresaw. So in New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities. And I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And that absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Well, sorry, excuse me for jumping in, but I want to bring in Professor Pete here, because we did show those words to our audience at home, and perhaps the control room can show it to our audience once again. When you look at those alternate pronouns, I think it's fair to say that some people will see that at home and see that as very unwieldy, if you will. What do you say to those types of criticisms, including the one you just heard from Professor Peterson?
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. You know, we call somebody what they want to be called in our society. For instance, I don't call somebody Julie if they prefer to be called Jordan. That's just basic human courtesy. Here's a great little tip for people who are despairing at the possibility of remembering all those pronouns. What I do is just program in the pronoun next to the person's name in my smartphone. So whenever I'm out and about and I've forgotten whether one of my trans friends uses ze or zer or they or them or something else, I just look it up and it's really super easy. One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centered in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the center of attention in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people. It's about protections for transgender people. And that's not, it's not about Jordan Peterson. So, we should have people learning to listen more. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a very good reason. When things get political, I like to ask who benefits and who gets to decide the rules of the game. So, mostly with this Peterson controversy, which is really just a small drama, a tempest in a teapot, he could just get over learning to program a few pronouns into his phone. By the way, I only have half a dozen or so that I actually use on an everyday basis, so it's not all that difficult.
Professor Peterson, sorry, Professor Peterson, good jumping because I think Professor Peterson wants to get in on that.
这边我补充一下，一开始 Jordan Peterson 教授的论述就非常的具体，非常的客观。如果按照过去人类语言学的发展来看的话，语言确实它是在动态变化的，而且会随着那个时代的一些需求或需要化，自然而然会有一些新的名词被创造所产生。但是语言学的变化从来就不是政府用刻意的立法的方式去规范人们该说什么话，所以这是不符合人类的语言学的发展的。换句话说，如果跨性别者在对于代称词的这种需求上是真的有这么一个显著的需要的话，那其自然的人们自然会去发展这样的语言学的结构。可是过去并没有，所以我认为这一点对于反方的 P 教授来讲呢，因为他并没有办法能够从语言学的历史去做一个反驳，所以呢，他从另外一个角度去对 Peterson 教授做攻击。第一个角度就是简易的方式，为什么你不愿意做？他说现在目前的代称词只多新增出来6个，那他认为这6种你只要用手机一查询就很容易很方便。好，那为什么这么方便你不做呢？我认为这个论点其实是非常的幼稚。为什么？因为事实上方便的事情太多了，可是人们的生活习惯不会因为它方便，或者说因为它只是举手之劳就非得要去做它，对不对？我举一个例子很简单，就好像说，如果真的你认为这个代称词这么重要的话，那你为什么不自己挂一个名牌，上面把6个名词都写给大家看呢？为什么非要我去查呢？难道挂一个名牌对你而言不方便吗？你挂一个名牌，你把你的代称词写在上面，是不是让别人如果真的要尊重你的话，也会觉得我一看我就知道怎么称呼你的，我连问都不用问，甚至我连手机查都不用查。那请问这又有什么难的呢？这不是也是一个举手之劳你就做到的事情吗？可是你不会做啊，为什么？因为我们人从来都不是因为方不方便而做，而是大家的共同有没有这个需求产生的习惯而决定的。圣经上有一句话说得很好，就是凡事都可行，但不都有益处，大概就是这个道理。好，那 P 教授第二个反驳的论点是什么呢？就是他去给 Peterson 教授贴一个标签，就是我觉得是因为你只在乎你自己。我认为在这一个第二论点上面呢，这个都是非常主观的一种看法，完全没有客观性可比较，因为Jordan Peterson 教授的主张也是大多数人的一个看法，所以他并不是在代替他自己单方面去回答这个问题的，而是大家的习惯里本来就没有，那你为什么一定要强加别人一定要有这个拿手机去查找代名词的习惯？而且我们必须话又说回来了，如果人与人之间的语言要谈论要这么费劲的话，那我们到底是进步还是倒退呢？我们继续看下去。
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all. So, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely in case we offend someone?
Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first name, you remember their telephone number. I mean, I think that it's
I don't
very,
remember
very
people's
true
first names
that
very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
that's you
they
being
appear
lazy,
that way.
Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's a very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn. So, trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social justice... Am I a social justice warrior? I don't know. But I think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering independent cultural traditions of minorities, and being willing to share power with people who are different than you. I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month. For example, have you recently had a bank employee accuse you of trying to masquerade as yourself at a bank and then locking down your ATM card and credit card so that you can't use any money? Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, considering suicide. These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked to a few trans people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Pete, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So, the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected you either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself and on behalf of other people perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And so I'm not taking...
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
legislation is how it's different. I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion. No. Because it's the way that you present yourself in public with your clothing and your manner of dress. And so I also think that the legislation that we are bringing forth with Bill C-16, and that's already in place in places like Ontario, also makes fashion criticism something akin to a hate crime. And because there's been so much noise about the identity component of this, we haven't even talked about gender expression. This is appalling legislation. And the idea that referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice is going to radically improve their status in society or their mental health is a completely unproven assumption. I think it'll have exactly the opposite effect.
Professor Pete, I want to ask you, because it's been brought up a couple of times, to Professor Peterson's point, if this was so popular, if this was so needed, there would be a natural evolution. There wouldn't be need for legislation. Why the need for legislating this as opposed to allowing it to evolve naturally?
Well, Bill C-16 and the Ontario Human Rights Code do not actually legislate pronoun usage. They don't specify 31 genders or anything of the kind.
But let me jump in, though. The university is essentially telling, at this point, its human resources people to use alternate pronouns, in a way legislating their staff to do this.
No, wait, the legislation the legislation also requires it, and the university made clear their concordance with that assumption on my part by mentioning in the letter that asked me to silence myself that I'm required to act in accordance with the provisions of the Ontario Human Rights Act. And so the university knows full well that the legislation does precisely what I suggest it does. It's not written precisely in Bill C-16, it's written in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And if you read the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies on such things, you'll see very rapidly that utilization of preferred pronouns is part of the legislative package. So
and they're actually, if you read the legislation, Jordan, you will find out that they're actually called correct pronouns. There's no preference about this.
There is on the Ontario.
There
is on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website where the policy is laid out. And if people don't believe that, they can just go look themselves.
Professor Pete, when you hear that this is a free speech issue, that you hear Professor Peterson in this case essentially saying that he doesn't want to be legislated to adopt new language, what's your response to that?
Well, I share a number of Jordan's concerns about freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus. These are both very, very important principles, and they should apply regardless of what kind of politics you like. For example, if you're a left-winger or a right-winger or an up-winger or a down-winger or whatever it is. But you know, the reason why we have laws that protect academic freedom and freedom of speech is primarily to prevent government interference in individuals' lives, in their business. It's there really mostly to protect against a form of structural violence. And these free speech laws were actually never intended to be used as all-purpose accountability shields, you know, so that you don't have to be held accountable for your actions.
I'm perfectly willing to be held accountable for my actions, and the university has already indicated the seriousness with which they view my actions. And I also do not believe that free speech laws were there to protect to regulate violence. Free speech laws are there because we use free speech to identify problems in our society, generate solutions to the problems, and then reach a consensus. So freedom of speech is actually is protection for the mechanism by which our individuals and society properly orient themselves across time. It's not even a principle, it's the fundamental method by which our societies manage to maintain the stability that they do maintain. And so
it's one of the ways we do that, yes.
Well, I would say that it's the fundamental way. So, and I mean, I think we could have a reasonable discussion about that, but because freedom of speech is so tightly tangled up with the means by which we solve problems, I mean, I think, you know, and then I talk, but I get corrected when I speak publicly, and the fact that I'm being corrected constantly by the people that I'm speaking with helps orient my speech properly and helps orient public discussion properly. And I can tell you, too, that if there wasn't something absolutely vital at stake here that had a lot more to do than with just simple kindness, there wouldn't have been millions of people watching, for example, the assault that took place during the free speech rally that was held a few days after I released the video, which I see that CBC conveniently omitted to include in their video clips at the beginning of this interview.
Well, Professor Peterson, we do want to thank you. We're sorry we're out of time here, but I want to thank both of you for joining us today. That is the University of Toronto professors Jordan Peterson and A.W. Pete talking about what.
好，以上就是全部的辩论过程。那我认为最后的部分呢，其实左派也就是跨性别的教授 Pete 教授呢，我觉得他的针对性非常的主观，要把 Peterson 教授强调成为一个只顾自己、只为了自己的这个不方便而不愿意去学习新事物，或者说学习用手机去查找代称词这样的一种自私行为，把 Peterson 教授的人设就是打造成不良善。可是呢，良善这个议题到底它是不是法律定定的一个最高原则呢？当然不是啊。法律定定的最高原则，正如 Peterson 教授所讲的，是我们在追求真相的辨别对错。如果今天是用良善为法律定定的出发点的话，那我想所有的法律它都不应该要有任何的罚则或是刑罚了嘛。因为所有的处罚本身它就是带有矫正性，那你能够说这些一定是出于良善吗？当然，我们可以从另外一个角度思考，就是良善真的是无条件的包容吗？我们可以来思想一件事情，一个父母如果真的爱他的孩子的话，你认为父母对他的孩子会只有良善这个标准吗？当然不是啊。我们父母爱孩子，我们除了良善之外，我们也需要给他们建立原则、建立对错、建立规矩。因此，父母在适当的时候，他是必须要有适当的处罚，才能够去矫正孩子的行为。这也就是为什么刚刚 Peterson 教授也说了，在心理学的表明当中，如果一昧的良善，事实上对一个人中长期的发展其实没有任何的好处。法律的定定当然也是如此啊。如果今天没有罚则，没有一些刑罚的手段的话，那么你如何真的帮助一个人能够更好的去适应社会，或者说去改善他的行为问题？所以我认为良善是一个心态，是好比说我跟你辩论一个事情的真相，我会持有一个良善的原则去跟你讨论，也就是我不会先预设你是坏人，或者说你是邪恶的，但是这并不代表我一定要认同你。 如果良善在左派的人士当中，他越发的显现出只是所谓的无条件或无止境的包容的话，其实这个在亲子教育上面是行不通的，而且这样子的原则事实上反而会害死更多的人。因为每个人都可以用自己的本位主义要求别人对他无止境的尊重跟无止境的包容。那如果是这样的话，根本人类社会就无法形成一个共同进步的动力了。最后你会发现，其实在言论自由这个部分上的话，只要是学者型，多半对言论自由都是抱有很大程度的认同感的。这也是为什么后面其实 P 教授比较是变成反攻为守。好，因为当 Peterson 教授指出说这样的法案是在剥夺言论自由的时候呢， P 教授只好用一个比较委婉迂回的方式说C16法案并没有真的明定说这个31条的性别的代称词都必须要使用。当然法律不会去规范界定这么细，告诉你今天有31个代称词你要使用，因为未来你可能还会增加啊。好，可是问题是在安大略省的人权法案里，也就是 Peterson 教授指出的 Ontario 的 Human Rights Act 已经明定了，如果你不用别人所主张的代称词去称呼他们的时候，你就是触犯了歧视法。那这个就已经是一个很严重的限定的，这个部分就是剥夺言论自由。换句话说，你把主观的东西形成了一个客观的法律条件，这样的行为绝对是荒谬。这也是为什么我说 P 教授其实到后面来讲，他会变成从转攻为守的一个原因。因为 P 教授我认为他自己内心也深深的知道，作为学者，他在这方面会有一定的冲突跟矛盾的。为什么他在后面的论述当中会显得如此的薄弱，或者说如此的无力？我认为是这个原因。好，那以上呢，论你有任何的看法呢，也非常欢迎的在下方留言来告诉我。那片尾呢，我们还是要好好的放一段呢，是针对这个跨性别人士呢，来教我们怎么去正确的发音出他们现在所多出来的代称词吧，让我们也抱着学习的心态，稍微的了解一下。其实我倒是认为如果是你新发展出来的代称词，好，那你们要彼此互相这样称呼的话，我个人是非常尊重，我没有意见的，因为我认为这就跟语言的流行语一样，你当然可以去发展出你自己，可是别人用不用那是另外一回事情。好，我想如果当这个发展有越来越多的人认同并且共同使用的，我认为这就是语言学的一个自然的变化过程，这个无关对错。可是如果今天是要用法律来强迫别人一定要照着你这个去说的话呢，那就绝对是违反言论自由的。我们这是超级神队友，我们下部影片再见，拜拜。
I use the pronoun set ni, nem, near. Ni, nem, near. And it's a gender-neutral pronoun set. It's a neo-pronoun. My specific pronouns have been around for over 100 years. Neo-pronouns are not that new of a thing. We just came up with new words that fit us better. It's fine. An example of how to use them would be the sentence, Ni went to the market with near friends who love nem. Ni went to the market with near friends who love them. So that is nem over there. This is near room. I really liked nem. He was nice. Not all non-binary people like neo-pronouns. Not all non-binary people use neo-pronouns. It's just personal to me.
Christ alone.